Muslim segment, an important growing segment, and as a matter of fact, the biggest segment ethnically of the Muslims in the United States, and probably in Houston as well. Throughout history, the black Muslims have been an important blessing and segment of Islam since the get-go, from the time of Bilal radiallahu anhu to our modern time, to Malcolm X and other important figures. So we're going to invite Imam Khalis to give us some perspective on this important topic, so we can learn how important that issue is and the role of the black Muslims and the blacks in general, actually, in the civil rights movement in this country and the contributions to Islam and humanity at large. Without further delay, Imam Khalis, please. So because of the interference with the microphone, we're going to have you come here so we can have the PowerPoint away from
Assalamualaikum. Waalaikumsalam. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Asyhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la syarika lah. Wa asyhadu anna sayyidana Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, thank you all for, first of all, just giving your attention to, as Sheikh said, a very, very important topic. And what I will share here this evening, inshallah, I think is still scratching the surface. There are entire departments in colleges and universities that focus on African American studies. And so when I have the title here, Islam in Black America, Identity, Liberation, and Difference. And I want to just start by just sort of giving somewhat of a shallow dive into what I mean when I say identity, liberation, and difference. And so we'll talk about history, but what I would like to do, inshallah, is to also give some lessons and where we are today. And in some sense, we could see. If we're not careful, history could end up repeating itself. And so we, as Muslims, we should be people that are students of history. We should be readers. We should be learners. Even Allah Azza wa Jalla calls us to be students, to look at those, to look at the sunnah of those who came before us, so that we can learn lessons, that we don't make the same mistakes that they make, to end up in a very problematic life in this world, but especially a very problematic life in the afterlife, inshallah. So, what I mean by identity. So, first of all, there's a difference between, who knows the difference? Let's make this a little interactive in the beginning. Who knows the difference between an African American, a person, let's say, from Africa? Who knows what the difference is? Or a person that's from the Dominican Republic or the islands that also may be black. What do you think is the difference?
The people there was not from Africa during slavery?
Yes. Anyone else? Any of the young people here?
Most of they were enslaved. They were brought here as slaves.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So when you hear, when we say African Americans, or sometimes the language is Black Americans or black, what's meant by this is those foundational Black Americans that are foundational to the United States. Okay, and we'll talk about the term African Americans, and some people have problematized that term in and of itself. So, for example, African Americans, that's a pretty broad term to call yourself an African, right? And so the reasoning and the logic, and this is a term, again, we're talking about identity and some of the identity challenges that foundational Black Americans have had historically, okay? And so people would say, well, if people in Africa would generally refer to themselves by maybe the country in Africa that they come from, Nigeria, Senegalese, Sudanese, right, Ethiopian. So no one generally will call themselves by the entire continent, right? Or if they are a part of a tribe, it will be Hausa, Fulani, Dinka, etc., and so on and so on, from the western parts. So why? Well, again, it's important to know that many foundational Black Americans or African Americans were cut from their culture, they were cut from their lineage because of slavery, because of colonialism and imperialism, that we can kind of see that's repeating itself today, unfortunately, especially with what's happening in Palestine. And so in the term African American actually came about in the 70s, mid 70s. Jesse Jackson done that whole entire era there. Now to go back, we were called colored, really coming right out of slavery. Like, what is a colored? Okay, Negro from the Spanish word for black, black, and there's some others that people have tried as well. So you see that if a people have challenges with identity, you can see how that can also affect self-esteem, self-efficacy, the generational trauma that can come out of that. Most of you here, you can trace your family back for generations upon generations upon generations, all the way back to your country. Perhaps even back to a particular village in your country. You can also say that you've had Islam in your families for generations and generations and generations. Some of you, many of you, even have scholars in your families. You have beloved saints of God in your families. People who are truly devoted. But typically African Americans don't have that. Okay. And so hence we have the identity. And I will explain, inshallah, how Islam actually helped to get us. And actually that was one, Imam Muhammad, that was a season, it happened maybe about 5 to 7 years where people were calling us Bilalians. So after Bilal ibn Rabah, radiallahu anhu. Okay. So again, so you see all of these identity challenges and issues. And so there are some scholars, even like Black American Muslim scholars, who say they prefer Black or Black American over African American. But either one you use is generally fine, right? You don't want to call a person or people what they don't want to be called, right? So now when we talk about liberation, we'll talk about the liberation means freedom. And that is, of course, physical freedom, just the release from slavery in this country. Also, probably most importantly, mental, intellectual, emotional, and psychological freedom. We'll talk about Carter G. Woodson, who is the founder of Black History Month, and some of the things that he said about the problems with mental enslavement. We can actually go to the first slide. So this is Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So Black History Month started out as Black History Week, okay? And the intent was for it to coincide with the birthday of who?
Martin Luther King.
No. This is so this was in the 1920s. But so it was in the 1910s, 1920s. Okay? And so this was like in the 30s and 40s. It was originally called Negro History Week. Okay, so this was before Dr. King. Was to coincide with the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. Why Abraham Lincoln?
Free slaves.
Correct. And then, so there's an argument, so-called free the slaves. Because when the announcement came, Texas held its slaves for an additional 3 to 4 years. Like that's how long it took the news to travel here. Okay? And so, Carter G. Woodson is also the second African American to graduate from Harvard University with a PhD. This is in the 1910s, 1920s. The first African American to graduate from Harvard with a PhD was W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, and he. You may have read in your history books in American history, W.B. Du Bois as well as Booker T. Washington. And these were two Black Americans during the 1920s and 1930s that were at odds with each other in terms of their program for Black liberation. So W.B. Du Bois was actually the first African American to graduate from Harvard with a PhD. So, in terms of identity, right, Black folk have been called many things, and of course these are the negative words, the N-word, coon, boy, and so boy is quite interesting. Boy is quite interesting, because boy is the opposite of a man. And there were times in this country, all the way up through the 70s, where white people, particularly white men, would just call. It could be a Black man that's twice his age, old enough to be his grandfather, and he would call him boy. There were times in this country, like these are stories from my grandparents, that, again, as I stated in the khutbah today, I was actually raised by my grandparents. My biological parents had challenges in terms of the race and some of the problems and the challenges with the inner city in Houston. That's a whole nother talk. But they would tell us stories. And they would say, like my grandfather would very well remember that if a white man was coming down the sidewalk, he would have to move to the other side of the sidewalk. If a white man would address him, he would have to look down. He couldn't look him in the eyes. There were laws on the books in this country that prevented Black people from reading. You were not allowed to read. In a sense, that was the saying, if you want to hide anything from a Black man, put it in a book. Okay? And there were slaves, and then people right after slavery, if they were caught reading, their fingers would be cut off. These are all stories in the books of history. And then, of course, as I said earlier, colored, Negro, Black, African American. And so to the third bullet point here, in terms of identity, it's important to understand Black Americans, African Americans, were actually a new people. Even though we can trace our DNA back to West African, I'll speak about that. But in reality, we are new people. When I mean by new people, I'm saying about 400 or 500 years old. Most of you in here, you're thousands of years old. Your people are thousands of years old. We're new people. Many, which are a combination between the slave master and his mistress during slavery. Okay, so when your culture, your people, you're broken and you're cut off from that, there are many identity challenges that can come out of them. Okay, next slide. So, I don't know if you can see this very well. So what this is my 23andMe. 23andMe is African Americans, we're sort of obsessed with doing our genealogy and really just trying to figure out where we come from. And some use Ancestry, and we're probably the ones that's keeping these people in business. And so, this is my DNA result. And so Ancestry.me is about telling you, putting the family tree back together. And so that's a different, but this is 23andMe. Okay, so I did this and found out that, of course, 72% African and 27% European. Okay, I remember when I first told this to one of my friends, he told me he was going to revoke my black card because I got too much white in it. So, but this is, so if you see here, 61% West African, okay, and what is now today Nigeria, Ghanaian, Liberian, Sierra Leonean, Senegambia, and Guinea, and then another 5% broadly West African. Okay, and then you have Congolese and Southeast Africa. Okay, so that's about 10% there. So this is me. So this says that one, and many African Americans can trace, it'll be West Africa. Okay, so you have to know that historically, Nigeria, Ghana, these are European colonial names. Historically, these were, if you read Islamic history, particularly Mali, the Songhai Empire. These were empires, okay? If you read about the great Maliki scholar and warrior, Uthman ibn Fudi, in history, general history, we call him Uthman Dan Fodio, okay? Sunni Ali. All of these were, again, this is what the Malayan Empire, Songhai, and this is what it was broadly known as before the Europeans came in and chopped everything up. And so, next slide. Okay. So as I stated, my great great grandparents were slaves. East Texas, right up the street. Okay. Garrison, Nacogdoches. So if you're driving, that's 59 north, you're going to run into that area. And my great-grandparents were sharecroppers. And so sharecroppers came right on the tail end of slavery. Okay? And all of these people were, of course, devout Christians. They were all devout Christians. Why? Imagine the slaves being taken, well, they weren't slaves when they were taken, they were taken and enslaved. So imagine these Muslims coming, because at this time, West Africa were Muslims. And so these are studies and DNA studies that were done. I pulled this one from National Institutes of Health, and this is another one from AGHG, that now it's in that 75% of African Americans, Black Americans, can trace their DNA back to West Africa or Central West Africa. Okay? And this, so we know here that these are Muslim lands. These are Muslim lands. So you're taken from a Muslim land, you're stripped from your culture, and what is culture? Culture is your language, your religion, your mores, your style of dress, all of these things here, and it was violently taken. Okay, and your name. And many of the slaves that when they first hit the shores of the U.S., if they said that their name was Abdullah or Omar ibn Said, okay, they were given new names. Toby, okay, Kunta, etc. And when many of these slaves were freed in this country, they began to take on additional names, okay? And they would call themselves freemen. So when you see an African American with the last name Freeman, what he is doing, what that family put together historically was free and man. They didn't want the slave master's name anymore, okay? And so you see these names. Even when you see names like Tamika, Shaniqua, this is on the, they're not typically Arabic names, but you can see it on the same measure. Tamika, Shaniqua. Okay. It's almost like something in the DNA we're just calling and calling and calling. And what we'll see here is when we get through this slide, it's almost like it's a miracle that African Americans are coming all the way back around to Islam. It's miraculous. Wallahi al-Azim. And so, as I stated, that part of your culture is your religion, and so the slave master forced Islam out of them, and of course made many of them become Christians, okay? And even the form of Christianity that was given to them was a sort of docile, quietistic method of Christianity. You're not going to give someone the same Christianity you have because they may rebel. And you have a nocturnal rebellion on your hands. So this is a part of the history books as well. If you study Nat Turner, who he learned to read, he was a slave that learned to read. And what he was seeing was where stories in the Bible about war. And then how Musa alayhi salam went to war, and how Prophet Isa is reported to have said, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And so he organized a coup against Islam, and it was pretty violent. Denmark Vesey and some other people. So, and so this is what these things is. Next slide. So now we come to liberation. This man here, his name is Edward Wilmot Blyton. Here's what we're talking about, 1910s, 1920s. He wrote a book in the 1910s called Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. He was a Liberian educator and writer. So, Liberia was a piece of land or country in West Africa that the Americans carved up, because there was after slavery ended, there was a repatriation movement there was a back to Africa movement. And so there were many people that didn't want anything to do with black people, any reparations or any type of recompense for them. So let's just get them a piece of land in Africa, and we'll call it Liberia. And so this is what Liberia is, the country of Liberia in Africa, very, very small. It's in West Africa as well. So he moved there, and there's a saying that when white people came to Africa, we know that if we read the story about I'm missing the name of the council, but when they sat and decided how they would carve up Africa. Okay. And they went around the western coast of Africa. When I go to Africa, I go to West Africa at least about twice a year, 2 to 3 times a year. And I remember my first time visiting what is called Kunta Kinte Island. The original name is Jufra Island. And it was one of the islands that the slave ships used to dock. The Europeans would dock and take the slaves from Africa. And so it's an actual island, okay? And in the island, you have the ocean. And you have stuff in the ocean. So imagine, and so I'm standing on the island, and I'm looking at the Gambia. I'm looking at Senegal. You could see it. But imagine people in shackles and chains, standing on the island, seeing your homeland. Muslims, standing on an island, seeing your homeland. And you can't jump in the water and swim back to your homeland because you would drown. Just imagine the trauma of that experience. And you can still see the cages and the bars, the cells that they were. It was a very, very emotional moment, but it was quite healing as well. Alhamdulillah. And so they're saying that when white people came to Africa, the blacks had the land. And white people had Christianity, the Bible. And when white people left, they had the land, and the black people had the Bible. Okay. And so it was this theological transfer that happened that was for the detriment of the people. And it didn't benefit the people at all. And so you have places like the Gambia. Why do they speak English there? Because they were colonized by the English. With Senegal, which is like a 6-hour drive, they speak French because they were colonized by the French. And you can still see a lot of those remnants of colonization really all across Africa. But Edward Wilmot Blyden, as a Christian, he eventually converted to Islam. This is 1910s, 1920s. He was traveling to the Muslim lands, even in West Africa, and even in North Africa. And what he was like the Ibn Khaldun, right, for Liberians and for black Africans. And because what he noticed, he was doing these sociological studies, and he just noticed that the Muslims were doing much better than the Christians in Africa. That's psychologically, emotionally, materially, financially, right? As well as, of course, in other words, that their deen was really translating into material benefit in their lives. And he noticed this, and he converted to Islam. And he began to write a lot of books, and which was a huge, it was his dawah campaign. Next slide. So now we're coming back to America. And again, I said we're doing somewhat of a shallow dive here in these beginning slides. This person here is called Noble. His title was Noble Drew-Ali. Now we're talking about the 1920s in the U.S. Dr. Sherman Jackson, and I'll have my last slide of resources of books and documentaries that I think would be really, really good, just as a beginning to understand the history of African Americans, the plight, etc. Dr. Sherman Jackson wrote a book called Islam in the Black America, looking toward the third resurrection. Okay, and in the book he talks about a lot of these proto, quote unquote, Islamic movements that swept Black America in like the 1910s and 1920s and 30s and 60s and so on. And he called them Islamiyin. He just kind of coined this term, right? Those people who were not really Muslims, but their aqidah was off, but they appeared in their social. They took on Arabic names and they try to have the outward appearance. And what was the purposes of these things? So he called them Islamiyin. And so one would say that perhaps Drew-Ali was one of the initial Islamiyin, so to speak. You know, again, you have to understand, during this time, Black people were just trying to get Islam any way they could get it. And you could see how Allah, alhamdulillah, was bringing us closer and closer to the Sunnah. Closer and closer to the correct Aqidah. Okay? And so my own experience of doing my DNA, and many African Americans who do their own DNA, and you find, okay, well, my people come from western parts of Africa. And then you say, okay, we know we're a Muslim, but you can even drill deeper. Because historically, for Muslims, whatever country you come from, historically Muslims have always had a madhab. Unfortunately, we don't value the madhab anymore. Muslims have always had a madhab. Muslims have always had a school of Aqidah. Okay, you either Maturidi, Ash'ari, Athari, etc. And there were others that became defunct, etc. But you had that as well. And in some cases, Muslims also had a school of spirituality. Right? What was your school of suluk, your school of ihsan? And so then you say, okay, well, what is the madhab in West Africa? What are the teachers like? Oh, they're Malikis. And you say, okay, wow. Now, what was the school of Aqidah? They're Ash'aris. Okay. And so you begin to back into your history even more. So Drew Ali, his birth name is Timothy Drew. He was born in Detroit. So what you'll find historically, a lot of these prototypical Islamic movements started in Detroit. So you have between Detroit and Chicago. So we talk about the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, and how and so all of these movements, because as we get to talking about Elijah Muhammad, again, born in Detroit. Imam Wasabi Muhammad, roots that go back to Detroit. And so Detroit, and in fact, you would see certain types of songs and things that would refer to places like Detroit as the Black Mecca, and Chicago as Medina. Right? And they call New York the Sudan. Places like this, and you can hear those things even today. So again, he traveled to Egypt, and he came up with this philosophy that by traveling to Egypt and then to Morocco, that somehow Black Americans were actually Moors. Now that's a stretch. Okay, and so he called himself the Moorish Science Temple. Okay, and so many of their places of worship were called temples. A lot of science, where you take some Freemasonry, mix it with what you think Islam is, and then with some Black Pan-Africanism, with some psychology. It was all about liberation and liberating Black people. Okay? And so, the next slide. And so now we have Elijah Muhammad, born Elijah Poole, again from Detroit. And some would say that he was actually influenced by Drew Ali. And you can see certain similarities. In other words, of course, Detroit, and then to Chicago. The fact that in the early days, they called their places of worship temples, right? They had a lot of religious symbolism as well. And a lot of people don't know, like this signature kufi that he would wear was actually made by a Desi woman. There's actually a documentary. This is Desi when she was making a lot of, in the United States. And she was his kufi maker. Okay, and so again, he really takes from Drew Ali, also takes from Marcus Garvey. And so the Nation of Islam was again another Islamiyin type of movement that also emphasized Black self-development, growth, business, and again, they have the white man was the devil. In fact, that was like, he is not only the devil, but a blonde-haired, blue-eyed devil. This is what they would say. So, what else but a devil would do some of the things that they would do to black people? And so we'll see that Malcolm X, and so this Elijah Muhammad, so Drew Ali, he took the name Noble Drew Ali, another similar. Right? Look what Karamna Bani Adam. Right, so they would take these titles. The white man will call you ugly, he will call you despicable. No, I'm taking the name Noble. Elijah Muhammad, he took the name Honorable, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Again, another similarity. He was a teacher of Imam Rashaad Muhammad. The father. This is the father of Rashaad Muhammad. And so we'll see that Imam Rashaad Muhammad disagreed with his father a lot, particularly around theology, particularly around Aqidah. Like, I can't get with what you're saying about Allah, because he studied. And his father, now some would say that his father didn't die on that. His father actually hired teachers from Egypt and from the Sudan to come to his home and teach his children. So I'm like you have this Aqidah, but you're bringing teachers from Egypt and the Sudan to teach your children Arabic and things like this. And so through that, Imam Muhammad, rahimahullah, began to study and read the Quran and read books, and hence coming to these conclusions. Next slide. So here's Malcolm and Martin. I just want to touch on these a little bit here. So these are the late 1950s, 1960s. We know that, of course, Malcolm, Muslim, Martin, devout Christian reverend actually. And they had different views on things. So for example, Dr. Martin Luther King, he was about nonviolence. He was influenced more by Gandhi. Okay, and he felt that you would get there through protesting and putting yourself, turning the other cheek. So white people would open the water hose on you. It could be you, your wife, your children, and blow you away with a fire hose, or beat you with a baton, or whatever. Whereas Malcolm X, one of the things he said, Malcolm X, rahimahullah, he said, yes, he said there's nothing in the Quran that teaches us to be to accept oppression. He says, yes, obey the law, be peaceful, do right by people, but if someone put their hands on you, send them to the cemetery. This stuff, so it's like a stark difference. Okay, Malcolm did not agree with all the marching and protesting. It's like, why are you allowing yourself to be beaten and hit over the head just so that you can go into an establishment, sit down and have coffee with white people? Why not support your own establishments? And so Malcolm was more of a separatist. He did not agree with the forced integration. And so one would say all of those years where young black children, my parents went through this, would be forced out of their bed, and it was really traumatic. So because you have to be bused across town, across Houston, that means that you have to wake up at 3:30, 4 in the morning, put you on the bus you all the way across Houston, when there's a school right in your neighborhood that was often neglected because of funding. But then you go to this school and all of these children are teasing you because they were taught by their parents to hate black people. And these things went on for years. And so there's an argument about did integration actually do anything? So next slide. And so Malcolm, he did not agree with putting women, children, all of this on the front line in these protests. Okay. So here's another movement that was very, very popular during this time. 70s. Dar al-Islam. Started in Bed-Stuy, New York. But they eventually had about 40 different masajids, centers, businesses all across the United States. This actually started Imam Abdul Karim Yahya, or no, Yahya Abdul Karim, it was two different people. Yahya Abdul Karim, 1970s. His teacher was a brother from Tablighi Jamaat. Okay, so he was influenced, so it was a Desi brother that had some soul, and he was able to influence Yahya Abdul Karim, and then he started this movement called the Dar al-Islam. It was also called the Dar. Was one of the most significant grassroots movements established by African American Sunni Muslims in the United States. And so this is one of the original masjids, Masjid Mujahideen, and this was in Bed-Stuy, New York. And these were the brothers that I would say they really began to dress more Eastern, to really have the outward appearance of Islam. Next slide. And this next slide is some of the women and children during that time. And so they had these businesses. They would actually sew and make their own clothes. It was really somewhat of like a subculture during this time. They were very, very influential in the black community. Next slide. So here is Imam Warith bin Muhammad, rahimahullah. So these are actually two pictures. This is one picture with him with Nelson Mandela, another picture with him with Yasser Arafat. And so we know about the 1975 transition. When Elijah Muhammad passed away, the largest body of quote unquote black American Muslims or Islamiyin were in that movement. Okay? And so Imam Warith bin Muhammad takes over during the transition. And imagine you have 500,000 people that you give the Shahada to at one time. And I remember hearing stories about like he would teach from a phone. Like this what you understood about Aqidah, this wasn't right. And he would teach Salah and he would teach things and so the Imams would travel to Chicago, learn from him, and bring it back. And so there was still some problems in that. Again, we're talking the 1970s. Okay? And fast forward, 1980s, 90s. So my point here about the American method. One of the things that, Imam Warith bin Muhammad and some other black American imams and Muslim scholars of this time, and I'll get into this a little bit more in the last slide that's coming up, is the challenges with our brothers and sisters that migrated to the United States, Muslims. And rahimahullah, he felt that one could be true to their American identity and also be a good Muslim as well. Like you did not have, because we had these challenges where African Americans were literally, okay, now you're in Islam, but now you feel like to be the best Muslim, you need to wear a shalwar qamis. Because somewhere psychologically you think that Islam is about a look. And your Islam is tied to your Eastern clothing. Yeah. And so we had all of these challenges in the black American Muslim community. And so hence this sort of talk about a fiqh for Muslims in America. Next slide. So I think I have just two. I think this is the last slide. So now we talk about the last point, difference. So we talk about identity, liberation, and difference. I'm just going to go down here because I do want to open up for some questions, inshallah. So, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Black people in this country fire-hosed, beaten, separate but equal, all of these things here, not allowed to go in different, couldn't drink out of this water fountain. There were water fountains, colored, whites only, okay? Even when integration didn't happen, black people would have to go around the back. If you wanted to go into a restaurant, you couldn't go through the front. You had to go around the back, okay? And I remember my grandparents, we used to talk about these stories. And my grandparents, so it was me, my sister, and my brother. I'm the youngest. And I remember they really beat into our head so much about the importance of when you leave out the house, you have to dress well. You have to look. It was really Islamic in many ways, right? It's like you got to have ihsan in how you look because the way other people are perceiving you. And so I could remember even like at the age of 6, I would be walking around. I'm a 6, 7-year-old walking around with a suit and tie on. Right? And then you're told that you have to be 2 times better than white people. You have to be 3 times better to get ahead. Now, I think that's a traumatic thing to tell children. But again, it was just the struggle of those times. Okay? And so when you see your typical black American and your black American Muslim that sort of has a particular swag that doesn't look accommodated, you don't think that it looks well or accommodating, right? Maybe the dress, maybe the person still wears suit and ties, maybe the person, whatever. Know that there's a history and there's an experience there and there's a why. Okay. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 opened up a lot of doors. Okay. Maybe you don't understand, like the Immigration Act of 1965. If it wasn't for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Immigration Act would not have happened. The quota system went away and all of these things. So this gets to a point about the chasms between immigrants and African Americans. One point was, your Islam don't look like moms. So there were like constant headbutting and problems that came about. You don't wear Eastern clothes, which is a point that I just made. You have 2 options for dinner: biryani or biryani. Okay, like that has to be my food. This is Islamic food. Go to your average iftar at your average masjid. Every single day. Every single, no diversity in the food. Well, converts see that. And they just won't come back. They won't say nothing. They just won't come back. The role of culture in fiqh. Okay, and we don't have enough time to really just go into this, how local culture is a deciding factor. Islam is meant to be multicultural and practical in every time, place, and culture. And I think this is an important paper. This is someone that I know personally, consider a teacher, Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah. It's a very, very imperative, very, very critical paper. I think that every Muslim should. It's called Islam and the Cultural Imperative. And I think if you just Google it, the paper will come up from the Nawawi Foundation. Next slide. And these are some resources. So if you want to just take a picture of the screen here, the first one, I've already mentioned that Islam, the Black American, looking for the third resurrection. And so what he means by the third resurrection, the first resurrection was called the first resurrection was with Elijah Muhammad and that group there. Okay? And so when that transition in 1975 with the Imam, that's called the first resurrection. Okay? The second resurrection, he claimed that this is what we're in now, where
Black Americans would need to become more connected with the Islamic tradition, right? You can't just approach the Quran and Sunnah like a buffet. You need to become a Hanafi, you need to become a Maliki, you need to become a Shafi'i. You need to approach Islamic fiqh, the traditional Islam, if you really want to embrace it fully. As well as Aqidah. And then what he calls the third resurrection is you have to have character development, you have to have akhlaq, you have to resurrect that third foundational structure of Islam called ihsan. And this is what he calls the third resurrection in his book. And then the other book is called Islam and Black Suffering. Here he really goes into suffering and points of Aqidah. So it's very, very heavy and dense in terms of theology. The autobiography of Malcolm X, I think, is an important read. I think if there was any book up here that any Muslim should have said in your lifetime that you have read, it should be the autobiography of Malcolm X. And don't cheat. Don't just get the Audible. It's not the same experience. And then Mustafa Briggs, Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam. Okay, this is a book that came out in 2022. Mashallah, actually had him in Houston a few years ago. And here he talks about, okay, when we talk about Black history, we only talk about Bilal, and this is good. This is sort of like all we know. But he talks about a lot of the other companions, right? He talks about Imam al-Suyuti's book, The Superiority of the Blacks of the Arabs, right, quote unquote, because of the racism that he was seeing. So Imam al-Suyuti penned an entire book about this. And he talked in other points here. And this is a documentary. This is a documentary actually on Netflix. It's called 13th. And again, I have the last paper that's up there. And I think that's it. And so I just want to open up. Anyone have any questions or comments or thoughts? Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. You mentioned some of the differences on that one slide. I'll be more candid. In the 80s, I was in Baton Rouge, and Imam Walid Muhammad, rahimahullah, he basically told his followers, was an edict, that are part of the Sunni Ummah. And so we called them Bilalians back then. So they closed their masjids, and they came to our mosque. We did not receive them well. Okay, so I'm just going to be blunt.
Yes.
Because when I talk to some of them afterwards, people are not giving them salam, people are avoiding them, never mind inviting them into their homes, not giving them the space to give khutbahs, for example. And some of them were imams, like Imam Fahmi Sabri was their imam.
I know him.
Yeah, and so that really, so they went back. So they went back to their masjid, and they really tried hard. So the way they explained it, even when they went back to their masajids, we did not venture over there. They would invite us to come and give khutbahs in their areas because of the areas themselves. Most of us immigrants were scared to go over there, or we didn't know how to talk to them. So they ended up, so now kind of, forward 40 years later, I don't see much of a difference.
Same here. I mean, we could go off on a tangent about some of those.
Where is it?
Yeah,
and
so
what should we do as immigrants to be more...
So the community associated, so there are many different strands of Black American Islam. The community associated with Imam Muhammad, in my opinion, is it's a dying community.
Yeah, it was.
Because most of the leadership are getting older. And again, it has some of the challenges that all religions and faith traditions have. The younger people are not as connected. For it's like, if you don't have babies running around on the floor in your masjid, you got some problems. If you don't hear children screaming and yelling, you have some problems. Okay? But also, just some of the fight that those brothers, like the fight has just been knocked completely out of them. And I remember, some of these things happen right here in Houston. right? And I remember, again, there's a defensive posture that's taken up by a lot of our brothers and sisters in the African American community, particularly some of the older guard that has had these experiences. Like, we tried. And so now we just have to go back and do our own thing for our own sanity. You all are just talking. And so yes, like every time the black imam gives the khutbah, no sooner than he steps off the minbar, he has to pull out his sword and be on defense, because someone will critique every single minutia of what's being said. Okay? And so on. Oh, sister, I don't know, like the way your hijab is wrapped is problematic. Again, these are things of urf, these are things of culture that we just don't understand, right? And so a true Islamic scholar would never say those things. It's always the lay person, right? A true sheikh knows how to correct someone. But it's usually just the lay people that really don't know anything. They get their Islam from sunnah.com and islamqa.com, Google it, and then step to you as if they really, really know what they're talking about. Like, Islam is not just a narrow path, it's also a wide road. And we forget that. And so this is some of the challenges. And so back in the early 2000s, Imam Warthadi Muhammad, he traveled to Syria. And he met with Sheikh Ahmed Kuftara, rahimahullah. And out of that meeting, Imam Muhammad, he sent numerous students, like young imams, sent many to Syria to study at Abu Nur. And mashallah, the imams that came out of Abu Nur today, like the communities are thriving because they were connected with the tradition. So like Atlanta Masjid of Al-Islam is one, Imam Sulaiman Hamid. And he also sent sisters there as well. Like I know some of them very, very personally. And he sent African American sisters and brothers there to study at the feet of Sheikh Ahmed Kuftara, rahimahullah. Any other questions? Comments? Do we have any, how's the sisters?
Sisters, sorry.
Yes.
So I have a question about Malcolm X. So
Yes.
after he performed his pilgrimage, so his viewpoints of Islam has changed. So can you explain a little bit what was before and after?
Yes, so we know that Malcolm X, he was in prison. And he spent several years in prison, became profound in terms of like his reading, his speech. He became a master orator. And it was really Malcolm X that put the Nation of Islam on the map. He had strong oratory skills. And he learned in prison. Like, how do you come out of prison and now you're debating people at Harvard and Oxford and beating them? This is Malcolm. In fact, if you search the top 10 speeches in US history, Malcolm X's speech called The Ballad of the Bullet is number 2. It's up there with Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. It's up there with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Malcolm X. Like, if you go and you listen to that speech, whether you agree or disagree with it, it is just an oratory masterpiece. And this is how he was. But Malcolm was very, very sincere, rahimahullah. And when you're sincere and you have a sincere heart, Imam Warthadi Muhammad talked about how sincere Malcolm's heart was. This is what allowed him to follow truth. When you have a sincere heart, you will follow truth wherever it takes you. Okay? And so we know Malcolm, he left the Nation of Islam, well, he's actually kicked out, before even Imam Warthadi Muhammad left. Okay? And it is through that, when he left, Malcolm had a lot of connections. And he began to travel. As when Elijah Muhammad kicked him out of he first suspended him. And during that suspension, Malcolm traveled a lot. He traveled to Palestine, he traveled to Egypt, he traveled to Saudi.
Algiers.
Yes. Tunisia, I mean, he traveled all over, and so he was absorbing. He traveled to the Sudan, he was absorbing, and he was learning. Okay. And when you have a sincere heart, you're going to come back and you're going to be scratching your head like, what I'm learning, yes, I understand black liberation and the struggle, but I have a sincere heart. My theology, my aqidah needs to be, on point, right? And I believe that I will flourish even more. And so he eventually left and he set up the Organization of African American Unity, as well as a mosque, Muslim Mosque, Incorporated, during this time. And so that was his, and the autobiography talks about that as well. So, and if you want to cheat, you can just watch the movie How with Denzel Washington. I think he did a really, really good one. Anyone else? Oh, yeah, Jazakallah. Alhamdulillah. Thank you all for listening.